Under the blazing midday sun, downtown America pulsed with its usual chaos. Car horns blared through concrete canyons while thousands of feet pounded the sidewalks in their eternal rush towards somewhere else. The air hung thick with exhaust fumes and the distant hum of conversation that rose from the masses like steam from hot asphalt. This was the heart of the city, where freedom supposedly lived and breathed in every street corner, where equality was supposed to flow as freely as the traffic lights that governed the intersections. But freedom, as many had learned, was a luxury not equally distributed. The crowd moved like a river around the central plaza. Businessmen in pressed suits checking their phones with the urgency of people whose time was worth more than most people's annual salaries. Mothers pushed strollers through the maze of bodies, their children's laughter mixing with the urban symphony that never seemed to pause for breath. Teenagers laughed as they navigated between the slower-moving pedestrians, their conversations peppered with the casual cruelty that comes from feeling invincible in the anonymity of a crowd. Street vendors called out their wares while the rhythm of the city created its own symphony of modern life. Hot dog stands sent plumes of savory smoke into the air, mixing with the aroma of coffee from sidewalk cafes and the less pleasant odors of urban existence. Construction workers on nearby scaffolding hammered and drilled, adding their percussion to the metropolitan orchestra that played from dawn until well past dusk. Yet beneath this surface of normalcy, something darker stirred in the collective consciousness of the crowd. It was the kind of darkness that thrived in the shadows of progress, feeding on the comfortable lies that society told itself about how far it had come. The city prided itself on its diversity, on its modern sensibilities, on its rejection of the ugly prejudices that had stained previous generations. But prejudice, like a virus, had simply learned to adapt, to hide, to wait for moments when it could emerge under the guise of something more acceptable. Then came the sound that made everyone stop. The heavy boots of law enforcement officers echoed against the concrete as they moved with military precision through the square. 6 officers, their uniforms dark against the bright afternoon light, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. They moved with purpose, parting the crowd like a blade through water, their destination clear and their intent unmistakable. Each officer carried himself with the particular swagger that comes from absolute certainty in one's authority, the kind of confidence that never questions whether that authority is being exercised justly. Their sergeant, a thick-necked man with 20 years on the force and twice as many assumptions about the world, led the group with the focused intensity of a predator who had spotted his prey. His hand rested casually on his radio, ready to call for backup if needed, though he doubted it would be necessary. This looked like a straightforward case, the kind that would be wrapped up quickly and forgotten by everyone except the perpetrator. At the center of their focus stood a man in military dress uniform, his posture erect, his bearing dignified despite the circumstances that were about to unfold. General Marcus Washington had served his country for 32 years, rising through the ranks from a scared 18-year-old recruit from the projects of Detroit to one of only a handful of black generals in the United States Army. His chest bore the weight of ribbons earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice on battlefields most Americans would never see. The uniform itself was immaculate. Every detail perfect from the razor-sharp creases in his trousers to the mirror shine on his shoes. The ribbons told a story of courage under fire, of leadership in impossible circumstances, of a man who had stared death in the face and emerged victorious more times than most people could imagine. The silver star spoke of gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. The bronze star with V device testified to heroic achievement in a combat zone. The Purple Heart was a permanent reminder of bloodshed in service to his country. But to the approaching officers, these decorations might as well have been costume jewelry. All they saw was a black man in what appeared to be a military uniform, standing in a public place where someone had called to report suspicious activity. Their training had taught them to assess threats quickly, but their prejudices had taught them to see threats where none existed. The officers moved swiftly, their training evident in every calculated step. Without warning, without ceremony, without the basic respect that should have been afforded to any citizen, much less a decorated military officer, they seized the general's arms. The sound of metal against metal rang through the air as the handcuffs clicked into place, the cold steel biting into wrists that had once steadied rifles in defense of the very freedom that was now being stripped away. The general's first instinct was to resist, to explain, to assert his identity, and demand the respect that his rank commanded. But 3 decades of military discipline had taught him the value of controlling his initial impulses, of assessing a situation before acting. He could see the officers' faces, could read the mixture of suspicion and satisfaction in their expressions. These were men who had already made up their minds about who he was and what he represented. Resistance would only escalate the situation, would give them justification for the violence that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface of their professional demeanor. So instead, he stood tall and allowed them to do what they felt they needed to do, drawing on reserves of dignity that had sustained him through far worse situations than this. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Some gasped in shock, their hands flying to their mouths as they processed what they were witnessing. Others pulled out their phones with the reflexive speed of a generation that had learned to document everything, to capture what they assumed would be another viral moment of justice being served. But there was something else in their eyes, something that cut deeper than mere curiosity. It was satisfaction. The dark pleasure that comes from seeing someone brought low, especially someone who had dared to rise above what society had predetermined as their proper place. A woman in designer clothes nudged her companion, her voice carrying the particular venom that comes from generations of inherited prejudice. Look at that. A black man playing dress-up as a general. About time someone put him in his place. Her laughter was sharp and cruel, joined by others who found entertainment in the spectacle of a man being reduced to nothing more than the color of his skin. Her companion, a middle-aged man with the soft features of someone who had never faced real hardship, nodded vigorously. Probably stolen valor, he said with the authority of someone who had never worn a uniform himself. These people think they can just put on some ribbons and demand respect they haven't earned. The phones came out in droves now, dozens of devices raised to capture what their owners believed was righteousness being served. The modern Colosseum had found its gladiators, and the crowd was hungry for blood. Social media would feast on this moment, they thought, would validate their assumptions and confirm their worldview that the natural order was being restored. An elderly man pushed through the crowd to get a better view, his face twisted with disgust. "In my day, we knew how to handle people like this," he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. "Military uniform, my foot. Probably got it at some surplus store." The officers showed no mercy, no recognition of rank or service. They treated General Washington like any common criminal, forcing his hands behind his back with unnecessary roughness, their own prejudices evident in every harsh movement. The shackles that bound his wrists seemed to symbolize something much larger than simple restraint. They represented the chains that society had never truly removed, only hidden beneath the veneer of progress. The sergeant stepped back to admire their handiwork, his chest swelling with the pride of a job he believed was well done. "Let's move him out," he ordered, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had just confirmed his own assumptions about how the world worked. "Don't want to give him more time to cause trouble." As they prepared to march the general through the crowd, more people pressed forward, drawn by the spectacle like moths to a flame. Children on their parents' shoulders pointed and asked questions that their parents answered with comfortable lies about justice and law and order. Teenagers took selfies with the arrest in the background, already composing the captions that would accompany their posts. The general stood there, surrounded by sneering faces and raised phones, his mind drifting to the countless battles he had fought, not just against foreign enemies, but against the enemy within his own country. The enemy of ignorance, of hatred, of the belief that a person's worth could be measured by the melanin in their skin. He had thought, foolishly perhaps, that his service had proven something. That his rank had elevated him beyond the reach of such base prejudice. He was about to learn how wrong he had been, and so was everyone watching. The city that had seemed so alive with promise just moments before now felt like a hostile territory, every face in the crowd a potential enemy. Every laugh, a reminder that progress was nothing more than an illusion carefully maintained to make the comfortable feel better about their complicity in an unjust system. The general's uniform, which had once commanded respect on military bases around the world, now felt like a costume that fooled no one. But even as the crowd pressed closer, even as their taunts grew louder and more vicious, something inside General Marcus Washington remained unbroken. It was forged in the crucible of combat, tempered by years of leadership under impossible circumstances, and polished by the knowledge that his worth was not determined by the opinions of those who had never been tested as he had been tested. The officers began to move, forcing the general to walk through the crowd, like a prisoner of war, in his own country. Each step was a humiliation, each stare from the onlookers another nail in the coffin of dignity they were trying to build around him. But even as his body was bound and his freedom stolen, something inside him remained untouchable, waiting for its moment to shine through the darkness that had descended upon that sunny afternoon in downtown America. The arrest had begun as a simple misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity that should have been resolved with a simple check of credentials. But the moment the officers saw a black man in a military uniform, their assumptions had taken over, their biases had filled in the blanks, and justice had taken a back seat to prejudice. The call they had received described a suspicious person in military attire, but the caller had been careful not to mention race, knowing that such details might complicate the response. The crowd pressed closer now, emboldened by the spectacle, their phones raised like weapons capturing every moment of what they believed was righteousness being served. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and the true meaning of honor. A young mother lifted her toddler higher on her shoulders so the child could see better, explaining in a voice loud enough for others to hear that they were watching bad guys get caught. The child, too young to understand the implications of what was happening, clapped his hands in delight at what seemed like a game to his innocent eyes. The general's steps echoed through the plaza as he was marched forward, each footfall a drumbeat, counting down to a moment that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone watching. The sun continued to blaze overhead, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below, while the city pulsed on around them, unaware that history was about to be made in the most unexpected way. The shackles clinked with each movement, a metallic rhythm that seemed to mock the very ideals of freedom and justice that the general had spent his life defending. But even bound and humiliated, even surrounded by hatred and ignorance, General Marcus Washington carried himself with the dignity of a man who knew his worth, regardless of what others chose to see. The crowd's voices grew louder, more aggressive, feeding off each other's energy like a pack of wolves scenting blood. They hurled insults and accusations, their words designed to cut deeper than any physical wound. Faker, they called him. Pretender. Just another black man trying to be something he's not. Stolen valor is a serious crime, shouted a man who had never served a day in uniform. Hope they throw the book at him. Military impostor, added a woman whose knowledge of military protocol came entirely from movies. Disgraceful to real soldiers. Each word hit its mark, but the general absorbed them like a soldier absorbing enemy fire, protecting something vital within himself that they could not touch, could not break, could not destroy no matter how hard they tried. He had survived worse than this. He had endured the crucible of combat, the test of leadership under impossible circumstances, the burden of representing an entire race in rooms where he was the only face that looked like his. This too, he would survive. The plaza stretched out before them like a gauntlet, every step forward taking the general deeper into the heart of a hatred he had hoped was buried in America's past. But as the shouts grew louder and the crowd pressed closer, he realized that the past was very much alive, walking alongside him in shackles, waiting for its moment to reclaim the future. What none of them knew, what none of them could have anticipated, was that the future was about to arrive in a way that would silence every voice, challenge every assumption, and force them all to confront the ugly truth about who they really were, when stripped of their pretenses and comfortable lies. The general's mind wandered back to a different time, a different place, where a scared young man had stood in a recruitment office with nothing but hope and determination. Marcus Washington had been born into poverty in Detroit, the son of a single mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. The neighborhood was tough, the kind of place where dreams went to die, and young men had limited options for escape. The Corktown projects where he had grown up were a monument to urban decay and forgotten promises. Broken windows stared down like dead eyes from buildings that had once housed hope but now contained only desperation. The playgrounds were littered with broken glass and drug paraphernalia, places where children learned too early that the world was not designed with their success in mind. But Marcus had been different. Even as a child, he had possessed a quiet strength, an innate sense of dignity that no amount of hardship could diminish. While other kids his age were drawn to the quick money and false respect of street life, Marcus found himself drawn to stories of military heroes, men and women who had transformed themselves through service and sacrifice. His mother, Dorothy Washington, had seen it in him, had recognized the spark of something special that she was determined to nurture despite the impossible odds stacked against them. She worked as a nurse's aide during the day, cleaned office buildings at night, and took in ironing on weekends, all to keep her son focused on school, instead of the streets that claimed so many of his peers. "You got something different in you, baby," she would tell him during their quiet moments together, usually late at night when she returned from her 3rd job of the day. "Something that's gonna take you places these streets can't reach. But you got to want it more than they want to pull you down." The military had offered him a way out, a chance to prove himself in a world where merit supposedly mattered more than the circumstances of one's birth. He had embraced that chance with everything he had, throwing himself into training with a ferocity that surprised even his drill sergeants. He had excelled in ways that made his superiors take notice, rising through the ranks not because of favoritism or luck, but because of pure, undeniable competence. Basic training at Fort Benning had been a revelation. For the first time in his life, Marcus found himself in an environment where his race was secondary to his performance. The drill sergeants didn't care about the color of his skin when bullets were flying over his head during live-fire exercises. His fellow soldiers didn't see his background when he was carrying them through grueling marches that tested everyone's limits. The army had given him structure, purpose, and most importantly, the opportunity to prove that excellence was colorblind. He had thrown himself into every aspect of military life with the passion of someone who knew this was his one chance to become something greater than his circumstances had intended. The battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan had tested him in ways that civilian life never could. He had led men and women of all colors into combat, had made split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died, had carried the weight of command with a grace that earned him the respect of soldiers who might never have given him a chance in civilian life. His first deployment to Iraq in 2003 had been a baptism by fire. As a young lieutenant, leading a platoon of soldiers who were barely younger than himself, Marcus had learned that leadership in combat was about more than giving orders. It was about earning trust under the worst possible circumstances, about making decisions when there was no good choice available, about carrying the weight of other people's lives on your shoulders. The IED explosion that had earned him his Purple Heart had also earned him something more valuable: the absolute loyalty of the men he had risked his life to save. When the roadside bomb had detonated near their convoy, Marcus had been thrown from his vehicle, his left shoulder shredded by shrapnel, his hearing damaged by the concussion. But his first thought had not been for his own injuries. 2 of his soldiers were trapped in the burning vehicle, and Marcus had crawled back through enemy fire to pull them to safety, his own blood mixing with the sand as he dragged them one by one to cover. That day, he had earned their respect not as a black officer or a diversity hire, but as a leader who would sacrifice everything for the men under his command. But for every promotion, for every commendation, for every step up the ladder of military hierarchy, there had been whispers. Questions about whether he truly deserved his position, or whether he was simply the beneficiary of diversity initiatives. The doubt had followed him like a shadow, always present, always ready to undermine his accomplishments. He had thought that achieving the rank of general would finally silence those whispers. He had believed that the stars on his shoulders would speak louder than the color of his skin. But as he walked through the plaza in shackles, surrounded by jeering faces, he understood that some people would never see past the surface, no matter what he achieved. The worst part was not the accusations or the insults. The worst part was seeing the face of a young black boy in the crowd, maybe 10 years old, watching with wide eyes as his hero was humiliated in front of hundreds of people. The boy's expression was a mixture of confusion and heartbreak, the look of someone watching their dreams crumble in real time. That face haunted the general more than all the hateful voices combined. The child reminded him of himself, at that age, full of dreams about serving his country, believing that honor and courage could overcome any obstacle. Now the boy was learning a different lesson. That no matter how high you climbed, no matter what you achieved, there would always be people ready to tear you down based on nothing more than the color of your skin. He had joined the military partly to be a role model, to show kids like that boy that they could aspire to anything, achieve anything, if they were willing to work hard enough. Now he was showing them something else entirely. That no matter how high they climbed, they could still be brought low by the very people they had sworn to protect. The general's throat tightened as he remembered his own childhood dreams, the nights when he had fallen asleep imagining himself in uniform, commanding respect, making a difference. His mother had encouraged those dreams even when they seemed impossibly far-fetched. She had worked her fingers to the bone to give him opportunities, had sacrificed everything so that he might have a chance at something better. Dorothy Washington had died 5 years earlier, her body finally succumbing to the decades of exhaustion that came from working multiple jobs to support her son's dreams. She had lived long enough to see him promoted to general, had been there when he received his stars in a ceremony that had made her cry with pride and joy. What would she think if she could see him now? The thought was almost unbearable. His mother had believed in him when no one else would, had seen potential where others saw only problems. She had taught him that dignity was something that came from within, something that no one could take away, no matter what they did to you. They can chain your body, baby. She had told him once when he was dealing with racism during his early years in the army. But they can't chain your soul unless you let them. You remember that. You remember who you are and what you're worth, and don't let nobody tell you different. The irony was not lost on him that he was being arrested in the very country he had spent his adult life defending. He had shed his blood on foreign soil to protect the freedoms that were now being denied to him on American pavement. The flag he had saluted every morning for 3 decades was the same flag that flew over a system that saw him as a threat simply for existing while black. The Constitution he had sworn to defend spoke of equality and justice for all, but the reality walking alongside him in shackles told a different story. It told of a nation that had made progress in some areas while remaining stubbornly resistant to change in others. A country that celebrated its diversity in public while harboring its prejudices in private. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, the general held on to something deeper than hope. It was the knowledge that his worth was not determined by the opinions of others, That his service and sacrifice meant something regardless of whether it was recognized or respected by everyone around him. He had stared down enemy fire and emerged victorious. He had led troops through impossible situations and brought them home safely. This humiliation, as painful as it was, could not erase those accomplishments. It could not diminish the lives he had saved, the missions he had completed, the barriers he had broken. The people surrounding him might see only his skin color, but he carried within himself the memories of every soldier who had served under his command, every battle he had won, every moment when his leadership had made the difference between success and failure. The shackles on his wrists were real, but they were also temporary. The chains that bound the minds of those who judged him by his appearance were far more permanent and far more tragic. They would go home that night believing they had witnessed justice, never realizing that they had actually participated in a profound injustice that diminished them as much as it was intended to diminish him. As they continued walking through the plaza, the general caught sight of more uniformed officers approaching from the opposite direction. For a moment, his heart sank, thinking that more humiliation was on the way. But something in their bearing was different, more formal, more respectful. They moved with purpose, but also with a gravity that suggested this was about something much more significant than a simple arrest. These were not local police officers, but military police, their uniforms crisp and their movements precise, in a way that spoke of different training, different standards, different understanding of what it meant to serve. Their sergeant, a woman whose own ribbons spoke of combat experience, wore an expression of barely controlled fury as she took in the scene before her. The crowd began to murmur, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The phones continued to record, but there was an uncertainty now, a feeling that perhaps they were not witnessing what they had thought they were witnessing. The cruel laughter began to die away, replaced by confused whispers and nervous glances. The general felt it too, a subtle change in the energy around him, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of something momentous. The military police officers moved through the crowd with authority that was different from the local police, a bearing that suggested they knew exactly who they were dealing with and were not pleased with what they found. What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present, a moment that would force them all to confront their own assumptions and prejudices in the most dramatic way possible. The black sedan appeared at the edge of the plaza like a shadow materializing from the bright afternoon light. Its presence immediately shifted the energy of the crowd, people craning their necks to see who might emerge from the official-looking vehicle with its government plates and tinted windows. The engine hummed to a stop, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended in time, as if the entire city was holding its breath. The vehicle was not alone. A small convoy of black SUVs followed, their occupants clearly visible as serious men and women in dark suits, with the kind of alert expressions that marked them as professional security personnel. This was not a routine government visit or a photo opportunity. This was something much more serious, much more consequential. The rear door of the sedan opened with a soft click that somehow carried across the plaza despite the ambient noise of the city. A polished black shoe touched the pavement, followed by a figure in an expensive suit that commanded attention without saying a word. The man who emerged was tall, distinguished, with silver hair that caught the sunlight and a bearing that spoke of power and authority earned through decades of public service. Defense Secretary William Patterson had served in that role for 3 years, a lifetime politician who had worked his way up through the ranks of government with careful calculation and strategic alliances. But he was not merely a political animal. He was a former Marine himself, a man who understood military culture and respected military service in ways that many civilian leaders did not. He was not known for spontaneous public appearances, especially not in downtown plazas where crowds of ordinary citizens might surround him. His security detail materialized around him like a protective cocoon, their eyes scanning the crowd for potential threats, their hands positioned near concealed weapons that everyone assumed were there but no one could see. The crowd recognized him immediately. Phones that had been recording the general's humiliation now swiveled toward this unexpected celebrity appearance. Voices rose in excitement, people calling out questions and comments. The energy shifting from cruel entertainment to genuine curiosity about why such a high-ranking official would appear at what seemed to be a routine arrest. "Mr. Secretary," someone shouted from the crowd. "What brings you here? Is this about national security?" called another voice. Patterson ignored the questions, his attention focused entirely on the scene before him. His face was carefully controlled, but those who knew him well would have recognized the signs of barely contained fury in the tightness around his eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The general saw him too, and for the first time since the handcuffs had clicked into place, he felt something other than resignation. He knew Secretary Patterson personally, had briefed him on multiple occasions, had sat across from him in Pentagon conference rooms discussing matters of national security. They had worked together on complex military operations, had shared the burden of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. But this was different. This was not the controlled environment of a government building where protocol dictated every interaction. This was a public confrontation that could go in any direction, a moment where careers could be made or destroyed by a single word or gesture. Patterson moved through the crowd with purpose, his security detail creating a path through the mass of bodies that pressed forward eagerly. The local police officers holding the general seemed uncertain now, their confidence shaken by the appearance of someone so far above their pay grade. They had been so sure of themselves moments before, so confident in their authority and their assumptions. Now they found themselves in the presence of a man who could end their careers with a phone call, who commanded resources they could barely imagine, who moved in circles where decisions were made that affected the fate of nations. The sergeant who had led the arrest found himself face to face with power on a scale he had never encountered. His usual swagger evaporated as he realized that this simple arrest might not be as simple as he had assumed. The comfortable certainties that had guided his actions just moments before were crumbling under the weight of this new reality. The crowd's mood shifted again as Patterson approached. The cruel laughter died away, replaced by an expectant silence that stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. Everyone sensed that they were about to witness something significant, though no one could predict exactly what form that significance would take. Some in the crowd began to back away, suddenly less eager to be associated with what they had been cheering just moments before. Others pressed forward, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing history in the making. The phones continued to record, but now they captured uncertainty instead of cruel satisfaction. The general stood as straight as his restraints would allow, his military training taking over even in this most civilian of circumstances. 32 years of service had ingrained certain responses so deeply that they operated independent of conscious thought. He was a soldier first and always, regardless of the circumstances in which he found himself. Patterson stopped just a few feet away from the general, close enough that their eyes met directly, close enough that every nuance of expression could be read by both men. The crowd held its collective breath, phones capturing every second of the encounter, everyone waiting to see how this drama would unfold. The defense secretary's face was a mask of controlled emotion, but his eyes told a different story. They blazed with an intensity that spoke of personal offense, of professional outrage, of a man who had witnessed something that violated every principle he held dear. What the crowd expected was condemnation. They expected the defense secretary to speak words that would validate their assumptions, confirm their prejudices, perhaps even commend the officers for their swift action in apprehending what they assumed must be some kind of impostor or criminal. What they got instead was something that shattered every assumption they had made. Secretary Patterson came to attention with military precision, his spine straight, his shoulders back, his entire posture speaking a language that every veteran in the crowd understood immediately. His right hand rose in a perfect salute, the kind of salute that is earned through respect rather than demanded through rank. The gesture was flawless, executed with the precision of a man who had performed it thousands of times, who understood its meaning on a level that went beyond mere protocol. This was not a political gesture or a public relations stunt. This was recognition, acknowledgement, respect given where respect was due. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single voice spoke. Not a single phone camera wavered. Not a single person in that entire plaza moved so much as a muscle as they processed what they were seeing. The Defense Secretary of the United States of America was saluting a man they had watched being shackled like a common criminal. The salute seemed to last forever, stretching through seconds that felt like hours, each moment adding weight to the gesture until it became something more than a simple military courtesy. It became a statement, a declaration, a line drawn in the sand that separated truth from assumption, reality from prejudice. General Washington, Patterson's voice carried clearly across the plaza, pitched at exactly the right volume to be heard by everyone without seeming like he was performing for the crowd. I apologize for this inexcusable treatment. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. General Washington. Not an impostor, not a criminal. Not a black man playing dress-up in a military uniform. An actual general in the United States Army, a man who had earned his rank through service and sacrifice, who commanded the respect and recognition of the highest levels of government. The revelation rippled through the crowd like shockwaves from an earthquake, each person processing the information at their own speed, each face showing the exact moment when understanding dawned. The phones that had been raised to capture spectacle now captured something entirely different. Their own ignorance made manifest. The officers holding the general's arms suddenly found themselves in an impossible position. Their hands, which had gripped his arms with such confidence moments before, now felt like they were touching molten metal. They had shackled a general. They had humiliated a decorated war hero. They had treated a man who had earned multiple Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart like a common street criminal. The realization hit them with devastating force, each officer suddenly understanding that their careers, their reputations, their futures were hanging in the balance. The sergeant who had led the arrest felt his mouth go dry as he contemplated the investigations that would surely follow, the questions that would be asked, the consequences that would cascade from this moment for years to come. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably, people looking around at each other with expressions of confusion and growing shame. The phones that had been recording the spectacle with such enthusiasm now felt heavy in their hands. They had captured their own ignorance, their own prejudice, their own participation in something that was becoming more shameful with each passing second. Children who had been lifted high to witness what their parents called justice were now witnessing something entirely different. The ugly truth about the adults around them, the lies they told themselves, the assumptions they made based on nothing more than the color of a person's skin. "Sir," one of the officers managed to stammer, his voice barely audible above the surrounding silence. "We had no idea. We received a call about a suspicious person in military uniform, and we assumed." "You assumed," Patterson interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of authority and barely controlled anger. "You made assumptions based on what, exactly? The color of General Washington's skin? Because I can assure you that his uniform is more legitimate than most, and his service record is beyond reproach." The words struck like hammer blows against the prejudices of everyone present. Each syllable was chosen carefully, delivered with the precision of a man who understood the power of language, who knew that his words would be repeated and analyzed and remembered long after this moment had passed. The crowd that had been so eager to participate in the general's humiliation now found themselves forced to confront the ugly truth about their own motivations, their own biases, their own willingness to assume the worst about a black man in a position of authority. Some in the crowd began to back away, suddenly eager to distance themselves from a scene that had taken such an unexpected turn. Others remained frozen in place, unable to process the complete reversal of everything they thought they had understood about what they were witnessing. A few faces showed genuine shame now, the kind of deep embarrassment that comes from realizing you have participated in something truly ugly. The woman who had made the comment about playing dress-up now stood with tears streaming down her face, the reality of what she had witnessed hitting her with devastating force. The general himself remained perfectly still, his dignity intact despite the shackles that still bound his wrists. This was the moment he had been waiting for without even knowing it, the moment when his true worth would be recognized not by the mob that had sought to tear him down, but by someone who actually understood the value of his service. Patterson's salute remained steady, a gesture of respect that spoke louder than any words could have. It was a recognition not just of rank, but of the man who had earned that rank through decades of dedicated service to his country, through sacrifices that most of the people watching could never understand or appreciate. The silence stretched on, each second adding weight to the moment, forcing everyone present to reconsider everything they thought they knew about justice, about respect, about the true meaning of honor. The afternoon sun continued to blaze overhead, but something fundamental had shifted in that plaza, something that could never be changed back. What happened next would determine not just how this particular incident would be resolved, but how everyone involved would remember this day for the rest of their lives.